Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. They're calling it a chance for a new beginning. 5 years after global climate talks in Copenhagen ended in a flop, environmental activists are daring to dream green again. This week's UN Climate Summit in New York was a sort of dress rehearsal for next year's global climate talks here in Paris. Now, that's when leaders from the world's biggest polluters will get another chance to redeem their green credentials. Now, my guest today is joining us from New York. She's helping spearhead Europe's ambitions to be a global role model in all things green. Connie Hedegaard is Europe's Commissioner for Climate Action. She faces a very tough challenge trying to get all of the EU members on board with the same message. Thank you for joining us today. I know you're having a very busy day, Connie Hedegaard. I want to ask you, starting with last weekend, we saw hundreds of thousands of people across the world, 150 cities, marching, calling for action on climate change, the biggest such march perhaps in human history. I assume you were watching it. What were you thinking?
I was actually also marching there. I thought it was great, and I think that that is what many governments around the planet needs, that the citizens start to get really serious in their messaging to their politicians, that they expect them to act on climate change. And that call from the big march in New York and all the other marches around the planet, that was a very strong call. That was also heard by politicians, I would say.
Now, you obviously are the European Commissioner, and your dossier is Europe. One image that stands out for me from the last climate summit in Copenhagen, 2009, Barack Obama meeting with the then Chinese leader Hu Jintao for 2 hours. And the president of the European Commission, Jose Manuel Barroso, was kept waiting, cooling his heels in a waiting room. And it sent this message that U.S. and China are the big players on climate, perhaps, and Europe was an afterthought. Do you agree with that? I mean, is that changing a little bit?
I actually think the story was slightly different, namely that Europe had its policies in place at that time, had the policies up to 2020, whereas the big two, China and US, they were the ones in Copenhagen dragging their feet. That is what we've been working on ever since, because in Europe we're doing our homework right now. I suspect that our 28 heads of states next month will agree on our 2030 climate and energy targets, 40% reduction in greenhouse gases in Europe by 2030. It's not a small thing, it's a big thing. But we need to do our homework, we need to do our fair share, but it doesn't help a lot if the Americans, the second largest emitter of the world, and the Chinese, now the biggest emitter worldwide, if they are also not doing their fair lifting. And that is still what the climate talks are all about. The world can simply not do climate change in the way we need to do unless the two big ones come on board with more ambitious action.
Right, and I want to ask you about that more ambitious action. China didn't send its leader, Xi Jinping, to the summit. It did send another representative, its vice prime minister. He said that China is ready to step up its efforts to address climate change, to get really serious about it. Do you believe him?
President Barroso and myself had a meeting with the Vice Premier yesterday, and I must say that my feeling is they are really thinking hard about what can they deliver prior to Paris. Of course, there were some formulations. They will deliver something when they are ready. We all know why it matters a lot that China early next year, like the US, will tell the world what do they intend to commit to in Paris. Why is that important? Because we need to know before Paris whether the combined effort of all the countries will add up to enough, and enough is to stay below the 2 degrees Celsius that the leaders agreed in Copenhagen. So the whole issue is how can we ensure that what can be agreed in Paris is not just an agreement, but that it is sufficiently ambitious to stay below the 2 degrees. I think China is getting serious. I think they're also getting serious because of their many pollution problems. They are realizing these days how costly it is to grow first and clean up later. So I was quite encouraged by his speech, but it's clear that we need to see how does that translate into very specific contributions that we only will know early next year.
And I'd like to talk about the other giant polluter, obviously. You can't ignore the United States. Barack Obama himself has said that climate change, and this is a quote, is moving faster than the efforts to address it. We talked about China. Do you think that the United States is doing enough, especially given the resistance in the U.S. Congress to serious climate reform?
I will give the American administration and President Obama personally the credit that they are doing more than we have seen for a long time from the United States. But then you could also say for a long time we didn't see a lot. They are engaging. They are trying to do whatever they can without Congress. And we heard from President Obama yesterday in his speech that they want to come forward early next year. He mentioned power plants regulations, he meant standards for cars, things like that that we know of. But I must also say, being here in New York these days, there is a big, big job ahead of the American administration, because what can come from them early next year cannot be a very modest thing. We heard from President Obama yesterday. He told the whole UN and all the leaders there that yes, Syria, ISIL, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ebola, it's all very important, but climate change is the challenge of this century. And we all need to contribute. And he said, particularly the big economies will have to do heavy lifting. We also need to see from the US very concretely, what are they going to contribute to? Because the dynamic will be this. If the US is not doing sufficient and coming with something sufficiently ambitious, how would we expect that the Chinese will do that? That is still the dynamic between the two big emitters of the world.
Connie Hedegaard, you talked earlier about Europe's big goals, the 40% cut by 2030 in domestic energy consumption, the 27% goal of 27% renewable energies. The fact is that hasn't been approved yet, and there still are divisions, especially resistance from Eastern European countries. How are you trying to bring everyone together on this issue?
Well, we are trying to find a way to say those who are, for instance, very much dependent on imported Russian gas and coal, would it not be nice for them to become more energy efficient? Take a country like Bulgaria. They are extremely energy dependent on Russia. Would it not be good if we could invest more in Bulgaria? Maybe they cannot do all the investments themselves, but then other member states could sort of help, and through the EU budget, we could help doing that. That's the kind of negotiations that are taking place behind the scenes right now. But I would have to say, today, I do not know how many of those viewing this would know. Today, Europe is sending 140 billion euros each year to Putin's Russia just to pay for our energy from Russia. Would it not be smart to be more independent, invest more in efficiency, invest more in renewables? So I think that what we're trying to argue in Europe is if we combine economic growth, jobs, and things that are good for the climate, then we have the right package. And I hope that heads of states will endorse this the 23rd and the 24th of October this year.
And I'll just mention that some people have pointed out the economic crisis, which Europe is still in the midst of in many countries, has given some people an excuse to drag their feet on climate change. Yet you just said that addressing this issue could actually spur growth, spur competitivity. Are you making that case loudly enough?
I think we are, and I think we can show sort of black on white that some of our economies that have done best during the crisis, many of the Nordic economies, that will not be the economies that did least in efficiency and renewables, things like that. You have very good examples in Germany, in Denmark, in other places, that they managed, even during the crisis years, to create more jobs in these kind of sectors. So you really can make an economic case. And it's clear that when we are sending 140 billion euros to Putin, and all in all 400 billion euros every year out of Europe to pay for our energy, then it makes simply common sense to invest more in efficiency and renewables. The problem can be how to get the investments going, but that's where the European investment banks and other big institutional investors can play a crucial role. And they are actually also represented this week in New York with a number of very, very strong initiatives changing the investment streams so that it will go more into a green transition.
Do you also see companies coming on board? I saw that Statoil, oil and gas company, recently said fossil fuels are going to be a large part of Europe's growth for the foreseeable future. How do you change that thinking?
But I think that it's true that fossil fuels will stay with us for a while, but that is why it matters not just to have a target of 40% for reducing emissions, but also to get through next month in Europe a target for efficiency and a target for renewables. Take shale gas. I know you have this discussion also in France, but shale gas, that can be a bridging technology, but it will never bring us to the low carbon society. That's where we need more efficiency, energy efficiency, resource efficiency, and much more recycling, plus more renewables. That is the long-term recipe.
Connie Hedegaard, we're going to have to leave it there. European Commissioner for Climate Action, thank you so much for taking your time on a very busy day in New York to join us talking about a key issue, perhaps the key issue in the world today, how to address climate change. Thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24.